Alright, the video I'm going to be talking about is Lion of the Desert. It's about Italian colonialism in East Africa, namely Libya in the movie, as Omar Mukhtar or Mukhtab. I think I found it both ways. I'm pretty sure it's Mukhtar. He is the resistance leader in Libya at the time. He's the one that the movie kind of focuses on. And the movie focuses on the latter part of the resistance. The resistance went on for about 20 years. Ended in, well, didn't really end in 1943, but you don't hear much about it after that. That's when Italy loses its holding in Libya to the Allied powers in 1951. They're released from Allied command, and, well, not really command. The Allies draw back and give their independence. But, like I said, the resistance lasted 20 years, and the Libyans managed to hold off the Italian troops who had tanks, and then later in the resistance, aircraft. Managed to hold them off with primitive weapons. And when I say primitive, it's more just older rifles and not good equipment, not necessarily like spears and swords and whatnot. And they utilize horses where the Italians utilize, like I said, tanks and like jeeps, not jeeps, but jeep-like vehicles, automobiles, which don't work out for them very well in the end, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So this movie was released in 1981. Like I said, it's the story of Omar Mukhtar and his resistance in Libya, and really just kind of the stuff I talked about in my presentation in the beginning, with all the kind of atrocities and the way the Italians treated the Libyan people. So the film stars Anthony Quinn as Omar Mukhtar, Oliver Reed as the Italian General Graziani, which I'm hoping I pronounced that name right, and Rob Steiger as Benito Mussolini. So, we start the film with the pictures of the atrocities, the hangings, and the executions of the Italian rebels, and there's actually a scene right in the beginning where a photographer sets up his camera and he's taking a picture, and they have a firing line, and as soon as the firing line goes off, the photographer's taking the picture, so he's trying to capture, the rebels being killed by the Italian troops. Well, that picture makes its way to Benito Mussolini, who's upset because his officers are telling him, we're winning this, the rebels are being routed, we don't really have to worry about the resistance anymore. But every day he keeps getting reports of, we've had to hang this many rebels, we've had to imprison this many rebels, we've had to, execute this many rebels. And he gets upset because they're telling him we're winning the war, but there's still more rebels. It's like they kill one and 5 come in his place, and he's feels like he's being lied to by his commanders. Like he can't, the great Italian army can't quash a couple of Bedouin rebels. Doesn't exactly make him happy. So he pulls in General Graziani, which I'm hoping I pronounced that name right, and makes him, I believe, one of the 6 governors of Libya, but gives him a lot of power and tells him pretty much his task is to fight and defeat Mukhtar and his troops. Or, if he can, bribe him and get him to work for the Italians and get the people to kind of stop rebelling and just follow Italian rule. So we see that, and we see the next scene. Mukhtar is teaching in a village. He's teaching a bunch of kids, because that's what he did. He was a teacher. He taught the Quran. He was a religious teacher. And he's teaching a couple kids, and we see him being very calm. We can see children flicking each other's ears in the back of their necks and messing around while they're doing the prayers and whatever, and he sees it going on. I mean, he knows it's going on. But he looks annoyed, but he doesn't blow up at them. He just tries to rein their attention back in, but there's some sort of fair or something going on in the town, and the children are distracted by that, and he finally just realizes he's not going to get anything else out of them for the rest of the day and lets him go. And he joins in on the some of the fun, dancing around and whatnot. And then, sorry, I'm moving my lid. And so we see that. We see kind of the culture of the Libyan people and the Middle East people in that. And then the next scene we see is a general or somebody rolling into a village, and they're rounding up rebels and putting them in shackles and taking them away, and they shoot somebody who I guess worked with Mukhtar. He said something about him being shot while running from a battle, so I think he was wounded and they tracked him to the village. Well, anyway, they shoot him, they leave the village, and no, they shoot him, they actually gather up supplies from the houses and throw them in the middle of the square, and he says, burn all of it. He says half of what they're taking in, they're giving to Mukhtar, so burn that so he doesn't get any supplies. Well, that causes some younger men to get upset, and then they join Mukhtar's rebel force, and then we see him riding with his men in the desert, and there's just open desert everywhere, and they know that the Italians have to come through here to get to where they're going. And he says, well, plan an ambush here, and one of his men turns to him and says, you can't hide a lizard out there. And so the next scene we see is that same general from earlier is coming down that path, and we see a couple of Mukhtar's troops riding out in front of them, almost like they're just traveling themselves. Well, they get off their horses, and Mukhtar's reading a book as he is walking, and one of the generals sends off a lieutenant to check one of the flanks and make sure they're not coming up on the flank. And as they're doing that, he goes ahead and drives forward and starts following Mukhtar and his troops, and he finds them and starts giving chase. Well, they run, and they're chasing. Well, the lieutenant finds some horses just all kind of bunched together, and he doesn't understand why there's just a bunch of horses sitting there. Like, not wild, but, tamed horses. They all have saddles on their backs and whatnot. So he starts getting fired on, and he starts running, and the general, or whoever it is, the colonel, I can never remember what rank he was, hears that and stops chasing Mukhtar, and he thinks it's some sort of ruse. He thinks that, well, they're just trying to do this to get away. They've got something set up. So he goes ahead and gives chase, and as they're chasing, out from the sand pop all the riders of the horses that the other guy found. So they start firing on the column, manage to kill just about everyone. And then in that same scene, and this is one of the links, this is the link to the video that I sent you. I didn't get to show the ambush. I really wanted to because I thought that was a great scene. But the scene right after it is actually in my blog post, and it's the video that I've linked here. It's right after the ambush, and the lieutenant that was sent off to check the flank comes driving up with his driver and the gunner in the back, and one of Mukhtar's troops shoots the gunner, and the lieutenant and the driver are defenseless. They don't really, the lieutenant's got a pistol on him, but what's he going to do? The driver doesn't have anything but a pistol either. Well, Mukhtar's troops start to take aim, and he waves down their guns and says, we don't kill prisoners. And one of his men says, well, they do it to us. And he says, well, they're not our teachers. And then he's brought an Italian flag, and the lieutenant walks up to him, and he tells the lieutenant, he gives him the flag and says, take this back to your general and tell him it doesn't belong here. And they turn around and leave. Well, that lieutenant makes it back to the general, and the general's not happy at all. And so I think he gives the Medal of Honor to this lieutenant for being so brave and bringing back the flag, and I've never lost a flag in my time in command. And the lieutenant tries to interrupt him and say, well, sir, he let me come back. And the lieutenant waves him off and says, yep, of course we're gonna give you the medal for, you're a brave man. Kind of just brushes him off to the side. And then his next plan is to start gathering up the villages and throwing everybody in concentration camps. So we see that in the next scene. We see them running in, and they round up some of the suspected rebels and start shooting people in the back of the head, and they gather everybody up, and they've got, everybody's chained up, and they're walking them out to, I guess, their camp. Well, Mukhtar's troops arrive back to that village, see that everybody's gone, and they give chase. And when Mukhtar's troops catch up to that new column of prisoners and soldiers, well, the prisoners take that chance to fight back. And Mukhtar's troops fight back, and they slaughter all the Italian troops. Then, of course, the Italian troops come in with tanks and vehicles and heavy weapons. So they have to leave. All the rebels are told to leave. The citizens say, we'll be fine. They're just taking us to a camp. You guys live to fight another day. And one of the young men that joined earlier in the movie that you see after they burn all of the supplies earlier on ends up dying. He gives Mukhtar his horse because Mukhtar's horse is shot. So he gives him his horse. Mukhtar's trying to tell him to get up on the horse. Well, he slaps the horse and tells it to run and tries to distract some of the other Italians to keep him off Mukhtar's trail. And they go back to their little camp in the middle of the desert and kind of plan their next steps. Well, the Italian general brings in a negotiator to try to talk to Mukhtar and tell him, bring us anything, any conditions you want, we'll meet them. We want to work something out with you. So they get word. Mukhtar and two of his men meet with the negotiator and two of his men in the middle of a desert in a tent. And Mukhtar starts saying, well, we want a parliament. We want a guaranteed safety. We want to be able to have jobs. We want to be able to not work for forced labor. And the guy kind of tells him, well, we can't guarantee any of that. And Mukhtar says, well, you told me to bring any conditions and you would meet it. And these are my conditions. And the guy starts backpedaling. Well, we can't do that. I've got a lot more to talk about. Mukhtar says, well, then there's no point for me being here if you're trying to bring negotiations and then back up on your word. There's no point. So they leave that, and there's a couple of scenes of him visiting the camp kind of at night, the concentration camps at night, and talking to who I believe is his wife. I don't think they ever spelled it out in the movie, but it seems like it's his wife. And he keeps going back and visiting her at the gates and then having to leave, of course. And they're forcing pretty much anybody able-bodied to do hard labor within the camps. And killing anyone who tries to escape and killing anyone who seems to be kind of an issue. Well, the reason the general wanted this particular negotiator, and it's not really spelled out specifically, but somebody alludes to it, that he wants things to go wrong. He doesn't want the negotiator to be able to actually negotiate. He wants pretty much to say, I've tried everything I can to negotiate. I've tried to give him what he wants. Now it's just time to decimate him. And that's actually something that somebody mentions to him. Well, what if they give resistance? What if the rebels give resistance to us moving through and, moving them to the camps? And he goes, well, do it the Roman way. He goes, decimate everything. And that comes up, and there's another scene where they drag people out and they start shooting people in the back of the head, just one by one. The general walks out and pulls out his revolver, and there's a scene where there's a child standing next to who I believe is his father. I guess he'd helped them in some way. And he walks up and pushes a couple people out of the way and cocks his pistol and pops the dad in the back of the head. And the child kind of looks over and shivers, but he's really trying to put the fear of God into the kid, which doesn't really seem to work, and it kind of angers him, it seems like. And then they open up with what looked to be a Maxim gun and just started putting rounds down on everybody. And then, of course, there's scenes where it's just back and forth. They're going to a village and taking, the rebels are storming an outpost. They're sneaking people over the walls and popping the gates open and running in and slaughtering the Italians. And the Italians are running into a village and slaughtering the villagers and taking the women and any kind of able-bodied men that can do labor into the camps. And it goes back and forth. And there's eventually a battle where Mukhtar is riding and his horse is shot out from under him. And no, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up actually. There's a scene where Mukhtar is visited by a couple of other Bedouins, and they're in Italian cars, and when they show up to the compound, somebody warns Mukhtar, and he says, oh, let him through. Well, it's his friends. It's old friends, people he's known for years. And they keep saying, your resistance is futile. You shouldn't be doing this. Don't fight. Just let them give you what you want. And they ask him, he says, all right, well, what do they want to give me? And they say, well, they'll give you, a prime real estate in the Italian capital here in Libya, and they'll give you 50,000 lire a month. And he kind of brushes them off, and they say, why all of your people are in concentration camps. He says, yeah, and none of them are telling me to quit. None of them are telling me to stop fighting because they all want their freedom. You all have given in, and I'm not going to do that. And one of the guys mentions that 70 years ago, we were, friends. We were kids together. And I guess I didn't really notice, but the dude's beard's really white. He was apparently over 80 years old when he was doing all this, and he fought. He didn't just sit in the back and, we're going X's and O's, moving stuff around. He actually fought. I think he was 83 when he was finally captured. So there's a big battle at a town they're trying to capture. The Italians are trying to capture, and that's kind of like their last stand, the rebels, in a way. It's a big town. I think it's kind of their capital. And Mukhtar is shot off his horse, and they managed to capture him. He can't get away fast enough. So he's kept in captivity. He's given a trial where they name him a traitor, and Mukhtar's lawyer tries to claim, look, he never accepted Italian rule as his rule, so you can't label him a traitor. He's just a rebel. He's not, he's a freedom fighter. He's not a traitor to Italian rule. Well, of course, the judge doesn't even, he doesn't care, so he sentences him to death, and soon after, the people are forced to watch him be hanged by the neck. And it doesn't necessarily end the rebellion when he dies, but he was the spirit of the rebellion in Libya. So it kind of dies out. People still fight, but it's not, they don't have him and his tactics and his kind of leadership. So the film really seemed to show the conditions that I mentioned in the presentation, because the Italians didn't care a thing for the people. They burned their food, they burned their crops, they destroyed their land, their villages, concentration camps. They were hanging anybody, killing anybody they suspected to be a rebel. And there's actually a scene where I believe the same lieutenant that Mukhtar frees, they tell him to give the order to have some rebels hanged, and there's a woman that lost her son in one of the battles that tries to help out. I don't remember what she does to be kind of identified as a rebel necessarily, but they've got her up on the gallows, and one of the colonels, I guess, gives the lieutenant, he goes, well, as a prize, we're going to give you the honor of doing that. He said, no, I didn't join the army to have women hanged. And so they arrest him for doing that and end up hanging the rebels anyway. But it shows very well that the Italians have no kind of sympathy for the rebels and the Libyans. Even the people who aren't really rebels, just anybody who's suspected of it is just brutalized, and everything they have is just destroyed. So I thought that was very representative of how the Italians treated the Libyans. The movie ends with Mukhtar's death. There's not really anything after it. And this movie was very well received when it came out by critics and viewers alike. They wouldn't show it in Italy because they thought it had put a bad name on the honor of the army. And then when Muammar Gaddafi visited Italy in whatever year it was, I can't seem to find it, they actually screened it in Italy. They showed it, and people actually liked the movie, surprisingly enough, even if they wouldn't show it after so long. But that would be the end of my presentation. Like I said, I will link that clip, and I will put my sources at the bottom of the video when I put it on YouTube. And I guess that's all I have. Bye.